We are excited to have Dr. Anurag Agrawal speaking this evening on monarchs and milkweeds. Anurag is the James Perkins Professor of Environmental Studies at Cornell University. He's based in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department. Anurag did his undergraduate and master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1990s, and then a PhD at the University of California, Davis. He's been faculty at Cornell University since 2010. His expertise is focused on community and evolutionary ecology, with particular focus on plant-insect interactions, coevolution, chemical ecology, and plant-herbivore defense interactions. He's published over 200 peer-reviewed articles in the scientific literature in these topics, and has received the American Society of Naturalists E.O. Wilson Award and the Ecological Society of America's Robert MacArthur Award, two very high-profile awards. In 2017, he published his book, Monarchs and Milkweed, which will sort of serve as the background to the talk he'll be giving tonight. And I just want to note that we will have a sort of a question and answer session at the end of this presentation. And the protocol for that will be putting your questions into the chat function in Zoom. We'll compile those at the end of the talk, and then I will sort of feed those to Anurag as we round out the evening. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the floor to Anurag, and we'll hear about monarchs and milkweed.
Super. Thank you very much, Jesse. Before I dive in and share my screen, I'll say that I think the year after I moved to Ithaca, Jesse and I taught field ecology together, and I probably didn't learn, I learned probably the most about the Ithaca flora and natural history from him. So I owe you a great debt of gratitude.
Thank you.
And it's served as an inspiration to continue learning about the natural world here. My plan today is to take you on a tour of really monarch and milkweed biology, and I'm gonna focus on three things that begin with C: coevolution, cultural history, and conservation. And it all surrounds the interactions between monarchs and milkweeds. So I'm going to dive right in. Here's the star of our show, and when I think of monarch butterflies in particular, I think of there was sort of the great transformer. I mean, this is an organism like all Lepidoptera that starts its life as a feeding machine as a caterpillar, and then through the wonders of metamorphosis turns into the, well, in this case, the monarch that's about to inflate its wings and pump hemolymph through its wings and come out of its chrysalis to become a butterfly. And the distribution of monarchs is kind of interesting. It's a single species, Danaus plexippus, but it's a pretty abundant, widespread organism. It's the lion's share of its native range is Eastern North America, and as many of you probably know, there's a somewhat independent native population in California, and that bleeds into a subspecies of the monarch that occurs in Northern South America. But the monarch, you know, I don't always love to use this word, but it's a bit of a weedy species. It has been introduced and has self-sustaining populations throughout much of the world where milkweeds have been introduced. And the diversity of these 130 or so North American milkweeds is geographically structured. So what I'm showing you here is a cladogram, or a diagram of the evolutionary relationships among the diverse, on the top here, North American Asclepias, and you can see there's a clade of 6 species that inhabit the Sonoran Desert. There's the 60 or so species we call the temperate North American clade that includes the common milkweed. And as you go down the road, there are other species. The sister group to Asclepias is a genus we call Gomphocarpus, and there are essentially 250 species that, to most of our eyes, would not look dramatically different. In other words, they have the same floral shape, they've diversified into various habits, and have the same kind of level of diversity in terms of leaf form and floral form. So a parallel, if you will, radiation in Africa that has generated even more species. Now, we're going to focus today on monarchs, but monarchs themselves, a single species, come from a lineage of butterflies we call the milkweed butterflies. And there's again over 100 or so of these milkweed butterflies in the tribe Danainae. But I'll just briefly, I won't really talk much about them, but I'll briefly mention that even on a single milkweed, like the common milkweed, yes, there's the larva and the adult of the monarch, but there are about 11 other herbivorous insects that make milkweed their primary home. So in addition to butterflies, there's a moth species. This is a Eucades eglei. Several beetles. We have the milkweed leaf beetle, as well as the cerambycid tetraopes and a weevil species, true bugs, et cetera, et cetera. There's a leaf-lining fly. So it's a pretty diverse community of insect herbivores that feeds on this plant. Now, conceptually, the first thing I want to talk to you guys about is something that we call coevolution. And that has to do with how organisms, when they are interacting over evolutionary time, engage in a reciprocal form of adaptation. I want to share with you a little a quote from a classic book that kind of was a highly appropriate metaphor for coevolution. So this is the Red Queen, that's probably familiar to most of you. And if I want to just read with you from Lewis Carroll Through the Looking Glass here as a metaphor for where we're going in our discussion this evening on monarchs and milkweeds. They were running hand in hand, and the queen went so fast that it was all she could do to keep up with her. And still the queen kept crying, faster, faster. But Alice felt she could not go faster, though she had not the breath left to say so. The most curious part of the thing was that the trees and all other things around them never changed their place at all. However fast they went, they never seemed to pass anything. In our country, said Alice, still panting a little, you generally get somewhere else if you ran very fast for a long time, as we've been doing. A slow sort of country, said the queen. Now here, you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. So the Red Queen and Alice having this discussion about running in place is a metaphor for the concept of coevolution. If we think about monarchs here in milkweeds, they are reciprocally imposing natural selection on each other. And what is the form of that natural selection? Well, the monarch is a predator or a parasite of the plant. So the plant is evolving to defend itself. And as the plant evolves to defend itself, it imposes natural selection on the herbivore, in this case, the monarch, to increase its ability to exploit. If we think about this over time, some people have made the analogy to an arms race, that both the monarch and the milkweed, or any two organisms engaged in an arms race, are investing more and more in their interactions simply as a means to stay in place or to stay to keep up with their interaction partner. So what I'd like to do next is walk you through what I call the natural history of coevolution. That evolutionary interaction occurs over the eons. But any summer day that you're out there in the field looking at monarchs and milkweeds or any other set of antagonistically interacting organisms, the behaviors and the traits that we see recapitulate that evolutionary history in a sense. So this might be, mid-June in Ithaca, New York, or somewhere else in New England, and the monarchs themselves have been migrating back from Mexico, and here have innocently, what we see is laid an egg on a milkweed leaf. The milkweed plant has been coming up from the ground from dormant perennial rootstocks, is thus far relatively free of damage. After 4 days or so, that egg hatches, and the dance, or the natural history of coevolution, unfolds. Well, the first barrier to feeding for the monarch are the trichomes, the leaf hairs that cover the surface of the common milkweed. And what you can see this caterpillar doing is that before it takes a bite, before it sinks its mandibles into the leaf, it first mows the lawn, or it shaves those trichomes that you can see no longer existing here where I'm pointing out. So before it gains nutrients from the plant, it removes that barrier to feeding. In the natural history of coevolution, for every barrier that the plant puts forward, the herbivore has an evolutionary answer, in this case it's behavior, to remove that through shaving the trichomes. Now, once that monarch sinks its mandibles into the leaf and takes its first bite, it meets with a pressurized system of canals that holds latex. I'm hoping that all of you have broken a leaf of milkweed and gotten that white, sticky stuff. Hopefully you haven't touched your eyes. It's an extreme eye irritant. But for a monarch caterpillar that eats nothing else, and I repeat, eats nothing else than milkweed, when it meets that first bites and meets that latex, a large fraction of those caterpillars end up mired in that latex and end up dying. I found this leaf in the field. The caterpillar had taken its first couple bites. A welled up droplet of latex formed there, carried the caterpillar off, and glued it dead to the leaf. I can't overemphasize how dramatic this is, again, given that this is the only food plant highly specialized to feeding on milkweed, and yet a substantial amount of them die on their first day of life. In this natural history of coevolution, the plant has erected a second barrier to feeding that's quite effective, but in some cases, the caterpillar survives that and carries on. What I'm showing you here is a little video that we call the vein drain. You can see some of the latex that wells up on a juvenile milkweed plant here. If the caterpillar survives to being large enough to be able to feed on many, many leaves, and this is a 4th or 5th instar caterpillar you see, what it does is it deactivates the latex by cutting a notch at the petiole here. And sometimes the caterpillar will spend 30, 40 minutes deactivating the latex by cutting the vein. The leaf will eventually, as we'll see now, hangs down. And in response to this, if the caterpillar had a bubble above its head, be very happy. In response to this, it then flips around and it might spend only 10 minutes feeding on the rest of that leaf, which has now been drained of its pressurized latex. In the natural history of coevolution, the defense of the plant, the latex, if the caterpillar survives, is meant by an offensive tactic, in this case, again, behaviorally deactivating the leticifers. All right, now milkweeds are famous for their poisons. We call them cardiac glycosides. And unfortunately, I don't have the time to really get into all the detailed chemistry, although that's fascinating stuff. In the 1950s, a brilliant British naturalist named Miriam Rothschild hypothesized that monarchs too were toxic and that they gained their toxicity by sequestering the poisons in the milkweed plant. She was inspired by Wallace, who had, in his travels in South America, had seen brightly colored butterflies that were poisonous. And they had hypothesized in those early days that, again, plants were certain caterpillars were gaining toxicity by sequestering poisons from their host plants. Rothschild, together with colleagues, demonstrated that, in fact, that was true, that the poisons of milkweed, which push at bay most other herbivores that may want to eat this plant, that are a barrier to feeding for most other herbivores, are tolerated by the monarch butterfly. With Lincoln Brower, who recently passed away, they demonstrated that the monarch was indeed poisonous and gained its toxicity from the toxins in the host plant. Some of you probably remember the classic textbook images that we now call Brower's barfing blue jays. When a naive blue jay feeds on a monarch such as this that's fed on milkweeds, quite repeatedly, 12 minutes later, the blue jay will vomit in response to that toxicity. So in the natural history of coevolution, the plant has put forward the barrier of leaf hairs or trichomes, of latex, and of toxic cardiac glycosides. And the monarch shaves those hairs, trenches those leaves, and has physiological adaptations that I won't get into today that allow them to not only tolerate those cardiac glycosides, but facilitate sequestering them in their body to serve as a defense against their own predators. So the caterpillar is feeding away. It's basically able to survive all of that. once it gets large enough, it takes about 30 minutes, once it hangs upside down in what we call the J stage, 30 minutes to unzip its last instar's exoskeleton and develop and show off its chrysalis. After hardening and waiting for about 2 weeks, depending on temperature, through the process of metamorphosis, the adult butterfly will emerge. And this process occurs over about 10 minutes, where we first have the green chrysalis, of course. We see the shell of that pulling away, the chrysalis darkening, and then the wing showing through, dropping out. And again, there's a little bit more time involved in terms of hardening off and ultimately being able to fly. But it's a beautiful and rapid process. Now here, folks, I have to dispel one of the most probably prevalent myths about monarch butterflies, and that is that they're good pollinators. I don't always like to talk about this because monarchs have gotten swept up with the, of course, save the pollinators kind of movement. And of course, when we save habitat that facilitates particular pollinators, it will also facilitate the preservation of things like the monarch butterfly. But the story of why monarchs are not particularly good pollinators is a pretty interesting one. So you can see here, here's our large, and I often think of it as kind of a clumsy, large beast on top of the milkweed flowers. And the way the monarch sits on those flowers, it never really comes into contact with the business end of the flower, which ultimately will yield fertilization of ovules. So you can see here, the monarch is certainly drinking nectar from the milkweed, but where are the pollen grains? Well, if we zoom in on this flower right here, we can see that the pollen grains are in fact not kept as free-flowing individual grains that we might think of as in most flowers. But for milkweeds, pollen is packaged in a structure we call pollinia. You can see all those tiny grains in there. Pollen is moved around as a package or a unit. The only other real big group of plants that does this are the orchids. So the orchids and the milkweeds package their pollen in these things called pollinia. In order to move pollinia around, to grab them out of the flower and then to insert them in the slit, which you can see right here, we need an arthropod that's going to climb all over those flowers and drag its spiny legs over this area to pull out the pollinia and then later reinsert them. You can see here's a honeybee with a pollinia attached to its leg that it, after crawling and drinking that nectar, pulled out of the plant. Now, of course, all of you know that honeybees are non-native pollinators, so you might be asking, who are the real effective pollinators of milkweeds in nature? This is the poke milkweed, Asclepias exaltata, common in shady habitats of New England. And you can see here that bumblebees are indeed one of the primary and main effective pollinators of milkweeds. Additionally, in the Midwest and West, as well as in Mexico, the biggest pollinators of milkweeds are other large-bodied hymenopterans. This is Asclepias verticillata, I think from Illinois, if I remember correctly. And this is a pompilid wasp, again, an effective pollinator of milkweed. This is from Mexico on Asclepias glaucescens. This is a scoliid wasp, I believe, that is, again, an effective pollinator. And in fact, you can see right here the pollinia heavily attached to its legs. So the main effective pollinators of milkweeds are large-bodied hymenopterans, whereas the monarchs, the way they sit on the plant, on the top of the flowers, don't really come into contact with the pollinia. All right, very quickly, let's move through the annual life cycle of the monarch. So here we are in December. They're already in Mexico in the overwintering season. September and October were the fall migratory season, where they left places like New England, flew those 3,000 miles to Mexico, and then began their overwintering. Now, a critical part of the story that I want to emphasize is that for these 6 months of the year, there really isn't a lot of breeding or caterpillars across North America. The monarchs don't need milkweed during this time. There aren't caterpillars feeding on it. really we have primarily adults that have flown the long distance from the Northeast to Mexico, and then they sit in trees at high elevation in Mexico for several months, for 3 to 4 months, before journeying north. And again, at that point, relying on milkweed. In March, they'll leave Mexico and they'll have their first generation in the southern US in the Gulf states, primarily centered around Texas. So the adults that basically come out of their chrysalis in August in Massachusetts and in New York, those individuals fly to Mexico, wait there for 4 months, fly 800 miles back over the US border into Texas, lay eggs, and die there. That generation lives 8 months. Those eggs then turn into adults by feeding on primarily Asclepias viridis in Texas, and then fly north. And there's a second, third, and typically a fourth generation that occur throughout the Midwest and Northeast of the US. Those are the ones that we see every summer. So just the pictorial guide to that a little bit. I'm not going to talk about their southern migration today, although there's a lot to say about how they're kind of their map and their compass in terms of how they get to Mexico. This is an image from Ontario at the beginning of the fall migration when butterflies start to cluster and fly together during the day. They only fly during the day. And then they roost on trees at night, covering about 30 miles a day on their way to Mexico. And now just a few images of the overwintering sites in Mexico. You can see there's jillions of butterflies here that on warm days when it's over about 50 degrees, they take to the air, and they're primarily at that point looking for water. They go to streams to drink water to keep themselves hydrated over those 4 months in Mexico. This is an image of a fir tree in Mexico covered, not in dead leaves, but in monarch butterflies. A cool day where their wings were closed. Again, when you look up into the sky, you can see them. And then in the sunshine, before they take off, they can be just coating the branches of the fir trees. So we're at 10,000 feet of elevation in Mexico, and a single square meter of these of the forest here, if we look up into the sky or into the canopy of these trees, we're talking about 5,000 butterflies per square meter. Truly an incredible spectacle. And in fact, they're so abundant that from the air, you can see the red or orange coloration here is dense monarch butterflies on the fir forests. So when folks are trying to enumerate monarch butterflies in Mexico, as you can imagine, we're not counting these butterflies, but instead it's the area of forest that is occupied by butterflies. That is our way of censusing them in Mexico. So after overwintering for 4 months there, they then start their northern journey again, as we described. There's some exchange with some of them going to California, although that population is very small, and various host plants as they again move north to start the annual cycle over again. All right, so that's my sort of tour of the natural history and coevolutionary biology of monarchs and milkweed. I want to talk a little bit now about the cultural significance of the particular toxins, these cardiac glycosides that milkweeds make and that monarchs make use of. Well, monarchs aren't the only ones that make use of these cardiac glycosides. And in fact, humans have a tremendous and very interesting history of interacting with cardiac glycosides. I'll just take you on a quick tour of this, beginning thousands of years before present. And the story is pretty interesting because the lion's share of plants that produce cardiac glycosides are in the milkweed family, the Apocynaceae. But there are a few other areas or branches of the plant tree of life where cardiac glycosides have evolved independently. And as it turns out, human cultures in North America, in North Africa, and in Europe have figured out that cardiac glycosides are in milkweeds in North America, are in squill, which I believe is an Asparagiaceae in North Africa, and in foxglove or digitalis, which is a Plantagenaceae in Europe. And in all three places, traditional medicine has used extracts of these three families of plants that have cardiac glycosides in the treatment of congestive heart failure. So they're called cardiac glycosides in part because they have a very powerful impact on cardiac function. And convergently, those compounds have evolved in those three plant families. And convergently, three human cultures have learned to utilize those compounds to treat congestive heart failure. But it goes even a little bit further than that. There's one group of animals that also produces cardiac glycosides, and those are the toads. You can see in this defensive secretion, the toad will produce this little foamy white liquid, which is rich in cardiac glycosides. And in traditional Chinese medicine, extracts of the toad's defensive secretion have also been utilized in treating congestive heart failure. To me, that just blows my mind in terms of the convergence and thinking about how the trial and error went to find those extracts to treat these maladies is truly astonishing. Of course, they didn't know what the compounds were, their chemical structures or their names or any such. They just knew that their function to be so effective. In the 1790s in European medicine, it became well known first among gypsies and other people that were treating people, and then later among medical doctors such as Erasmus Darwin, who was Charles Darwin's grandfather. In that time period, of course, the medical doctors were also excellent botanists and knew of plants and their potential. And congestive heart failure during that time was named dropsy, which one of the main symptoms of was the swelling of the extremities because of the heart's difficulty in circulation. Erasmus Darwin, many case studies and concluded that extracts of digitalis, which contain cardiac glycosides, were particularly effective in treating congestive heart failure. That was it's still used today, although not particularly commonly, but it is still used today. I'm going to fast forward some of the other really interesting anecdotes and simply take us to 1981 and the journal cover of the Journal of the American Medical Association. In the February 20th, 1981 issue of JAMA, sits the image of Dr. Gachet, of course, painted by Vincent van Gogh. And inside the journal was an incredible article about a hypothesis about why Vincent van Gogh painted the way he did. And this relates in some way or shape or form, presumably, to the cardiac glycosides that these plants produce. And I don't normally do this, but it's just one of these fascinating things. I want to read to you the abstract of the JAMA paper because it is such a gem. Vincent van Gogh, the Dutch post-impressionist painter, died in 1890. He was an uncommon man. Automutilation, depression, insanity, and suicide are part of his medical history. During the last 2 years of his life, his paintings were characterized by halos and the color yellow. So this was a dramatic turn, just as an aside. Van Gogh's paintings took a turn 2 years before his death to basically have this overrepresentation of yellows. Van Gogh was likely under the influence of digitalis intoxication, that of cardiac glycosides. This hypothesis is based on twice having painted his physician holding a foxglove plant, that this medicine was used in the latter part of the 19th century in the treatment of epilepsy, something Van Gogh suffered from, and that the toxic effects of digitalis may have, in part, dictated the artist's technique. What the medical profession has learned is that humans have a lot of variation, of course, and when a doctor is prescribing digitalis to a patient, you got to get the dose right. And when patients get too high a concentration and it needs to be lowered, their typical symptoms are yellow vision and seeing halos of light before they might actually vomit. And so this led to this hypothesis, which has been somewhat controversial in the kind of art history community, but more or less it has stood the test of time, that Van Gogh's artistic change 2 years before he died was probably due to overdosing on cardiac glycosides. I'm going to leave the cultural part of this talk with where cardiac glycosides currently are. And without getting into all the details, it was discovered in the early 1980s that they may have some anti-cancer value in treating cancer patients. It was initially for breast cancer. And currently there are clinical trials going on now addressing the role of cardiac glycosides as an anti-cancer therapy. And I think the jury is still out, as of course, probably only 1 in 100 of those drugs ends up being functional and without side effects to be used. But I think that what I understand is that currently it's quite promising. Okay, so in the last part of the talk this evening, I want to give you an update in particular on monarch conservation, not about milkweeds in particular, although we'll touch on that towards the end. But to talk about monarch conservation and how they sort of became an icon, I need to take you back to the 1940s. In the 1940s and earlier, as far back as American naturalists had been observing monarchs, it wasn't known where they went in the wintertime. As early as the late 1800s, the Comstocks, who were professors of entomology here at Cornell, they basically knew that in the fall, monarchs flew south, that they disappeared for several months, and that they reappeared in the spring. But other than the small communities in the highlands of central Mexico that obviously knew that the butterflies were there, American scientists and Western scientists in general did not understand their full biology. And so in the 1940s, Nora and Fred Urquhart from the University of Toronto began a tagging program as a means to try to understand where the monarchs went in the winter. They published reports, they engaged with citizen scientists. It was the first real citizen science project. And in 1955, they had 200 volunteers across mostly the US, although some in Canada as well. And those citizen scientists were encouraged to tag butterflies, to recover them, and to mail them back to the University of Toronto. And in 1955, this was the Urquhart's image of what probably happened. They knew that the butterflies flew south, and then they stopped recollecting them. They hypothesized that they went to California and somehow in the spring came back to the east. Well, of course, they were wrong, and that's 1955. The discovery took another 20 years to make. The Urquharts worked tirelessly, enlisting from a few hundred to ultimately several thousand citizen scientists. When they started thinking that the butterflies were likely going into Mexico, they had tremendous efforts enlisting citizen scientists in Mexico, putting out ads in the Mexico City newspapers. And in 1975, and with the help of an American and a Mexican couple who were riding in the hills and who had read some of the articles that the Urquharts had written, they finally discovered the overwintering sites. Not with thousands, but with hundreds of millions of butterflies. Essentially, all of the monarchs, the hundreds of millions that breed in northern North America, east of the Mississippi, east of the Rockies, excuse me, they all essentially funnel to the Mexican highlands. And as you can imagine, it wasn't announced on Twitter. It wasn't even announced on the evening news. It was announced in the August 1976 issue of National Geographic, and it was an international spectacle. So I want to take a quick detour here and just tell you a little bit about some of the unfortunate things that occasionally goes on among scientists. I introduced you earlier to a person named Lincoln Brower, who had been, it was his barfing blue jays that were, he had been studying the chemical ecology of monarch sequestration. In 1976, he desperately, once the monarch overwintering sites were found, he desperately wanted to get down there and study the ecology of monarchs in their overwintering sites. He had hypothesized that there might be birds and mice that had cracked the code and could eat the monarchs in their overwintering sites. But Nora and Fred Urquhart didn't want to tell Lincoln Brower where the sites were. And so what Brower did is he studied the National Geographic article and he took every word, got out the maps, and basically triangulated into to where they might be. A year later, he makes his way to the overwintering grounds in Mexico, quite angry with the Urquharts who hadn't revealed the site. And they actually ran into each other in the overwintering colonies. Lincoln Brower shared this image with me. I just thought I would share it with you. Here's Lincoln Brower himself. Here's Fred Urquhart. It's January 1977, and it's the confrontation in the colonies. We don't often like to think of science as competitive, and I hate competing myself. But in this case, there was a social aspect to the scientists that didn't want to engage. And Brower had enough foresight to hand his camera to his assistant and said, "Take a picture of this." Okay, but why am I telling you all of this? Well, until we understood the annual life cycle of the monarch butterfly, we couldn't be concerned about its conservation. Once we understood that the monarch butterfly essentially over millions of square miles of breeding territory concentrates in the winter into an area the size of New York City, did we realize the delicacy or the delicate nature of that annual cycle. So the conservation discussions about the monarch butterfly began in the late 1977, right after the discovery of the overwintering colonies. And there were many factors that were discussed: logging at the overwintering grounds, climate change and extreme weather, habitat loss. Of course, into the 1990s, discussion of insecticides and GMOs became very important. To our current view, which many scientists believe that herbicides and the lack of milkweed is really important for the decline of monarch butterflies. You've probably heard about some of the winter storms. This is another image taken by Lincoln Brower. In some years, if there is a freeze at that 10,000 feet of elevation in the highlands of central Mexico, there are up to 70% of the butterflies that may get knocked off and die on the trees. This is an undergraduate assistant of Brower's, you can see here, that is knee deep in dead butterflies. But one of the remarkable things about monarchs, because they have 4 generations a year, is there's tremendous geometric or multiplicative potential for the populations to rebound. Unfortunately, though, ladies and gentlemen, the population trend for monarch butterflies has been decidedly negative over the past 25 years. So here in this graph, I'm showing you years on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is an estimate of monarch abundance in Mexico, again, estimated by the area of forest that is densely occupied by butterflies. It's orange in this picture. And you can see that despite a fair bit of scatter and ups and downs across years, since the mid-1990s, monarch butterfly populations have been in severe decline. The worst of it was between 2010 and 2014, when the butterflies were at an all-time low. And that also corresponds to the 50 to 100-year drought in Texas and northern Mexico. We think that that drought was really problematic for monarch butterfly populations. The last census that was announced was a year ago, and the butterfly population has more or less stabilized in what I would call a low but not red zone. And of course, we're all anxiously awaiting the World Wildlife Fund will announce the numbers for this year. Typically, it occurs in January or February. So we're hoping that there's an increase, or that they're at least maintaining the population in this zone. I want to just briefly, as I close here, mention this issue of planting milkweed. And of course, over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been I would call it a national agenda to plant milkweed to help the monarch butterfly. Michelle Obama in the White House kitchen garden planted milkweed because she said she wanted to help the butterflies and the pollinators. Unfortunately, I think my own, I'm not going to show you these data, but my own analysis of the population, the annual cycle of the monarch, indicates that milkweed is unlikely to be the real limiting factor in the monarch's population. Of course, planting native milkweeds is a positive thing. I encourage people to do it as long as you look planting the native species. But to think that the data simply don't bear out that planting more milkweed is going to enhance the population back to the way it was. So what are the factors that are limiting the monarch population in its annual cycle? Well, our analysis suggests that getting to and establishing at the Mexican overwintering sites seems to be the break in the cycle. Populations are low in Mexico. They have 3 generations moving north, feeding on common milkweed among many others. And populations, as far as there are several estimates out there, tend to be very high in the hundreds of millions at the end of each summer. But by the time the populations are reestablished in Mexico, beginning around Thanksgiving, we see that their population numbers are down again. And this is where I want you to just think back to the issue of the 6 months of the year that the monarch does not require milkweed is really the end of the summer through the overwintering period. And that's where the period that we think that the loss or the decline is happening. During the breeding season, when they move north, the population seems to be able to recover, but it basically is not able to maintain that. So what are the issues? We hypothesize there may be a limitation of nectar sources as the butterflies migrate south. Non-lethal impacts of insecticides have been implicated. Even when insecticides don't kill insects, they often sicken or weaken them, which potentially has the negative effect on especially a long-distance migratory insect like the monarch. We know very little about the last 800 miles of the southern migration once the butterflies cross into Mexico and head to the overwintering grounds. And that's something that there's a tremendous amount of research now, citizen science going on in Mexico that I think will help give us more information about potential losses or the decline of the population as they move south. And of course, there's the ever eternal threat of continued degradation of the overwintering grounds. Again, we're talking about forest tops, mountain tops, the size of New York City in total. And there is tremendous pressure on logging, on extracting wood in those areas. There is a biosphere reserve and it's protected, but there is still wildlife-human conflict there. And it's a complex situation because, of course, the people have their livelihoods to look after. So, well, that's all I have, folks. That's Coevolution, Cultural History, and Conservation of Monarchs and Milkweed. I thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you have some questions. I'd be happy to answer them. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Oop. Let's see here.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Anurag. That was exciting. Despite a few technical glitches as we got launched there, I think it came off well.
Sorry about that.
We're going to ask folks now to put your comments into the chat if you're interested to do that. Send in some questions. I will read those off as they come in, sort of try to make sense of them and weave them together with the conversation. I wanted to kick things off maybe with a question about any sort of interesting issues or dynamics that might happen as the monarchs are switching hosts during their sort of annual cycles, if they're feeding on different milkweed plants with different defense chemistry or different defense traits, if there's any interesting things happening with that host switching during the life cycle of the monarchs.
Yeah, I think there's a really, the 2 dominant hosts, so there's 4 generations a year and 3 of them are mostly on the common milkweed. I mean, like 90% of the butterflies in the summer months feed on Asclepias syriaca. But that first generation is primarily, I think it's about 80% of the butterflies are on Asclepias viridis in Texas. And that's chemically a very different milkweed. And I've thought a lot about that. I haven't really begun to study it, but I think the challenge that makes for the monarch is that there isn't really the potential for strong local adaptation to one or the other, because in every annual cycle, they have to go through 1 generation on viridis and 3 on syriaca. And the crazy hypothesis I'd like to test is that there is a lot of predictability, right? So the southern migration is this big thing that they do. They then wait in Mexico. I've wondered whether that simply the act of migrating in that environmental cue might allow them somehow to prepare epigenetically to feed well on Asclepias viridis for that 1 generation, and that feeding on viridis for 1 generation might somehow trigger high performance on syriaca. But it's pretty interesting, I think, also because these other 100 or so Asclepias, 10% of the monarchs are feeding on these rarer species, and you know, they're able to complete development on all of them, but they face different challenges on all of them as well. So it's a pretty interesting story.
Great. So we're getting a couple questions in now. One of the initial ones was if you've had any thoughts about sort of the agricultural history of the eastern United States, and how changes in sort of land cover and, you know, abundance of milkweeds in the eastern US versus the reforestation that's happened in the last 50 or 100 years in some regions, if that would impact the sort of population dynamics of monarchs, you know, based on how milkweed has changed in abundance over that time.
Absolutely, and that's a, I'd say, I don't know about controversial, but it's a discussed topic, in part because, of course, most of the Northeast was forest. Here in central New York, it was 97% forest. There wasn't a lot of milkweed. And certainly the Midwestern, the core, we think of the Corn Belt now, were prairies. And to me, it's a little unclear how abundant milkweed was there. I mean, there certainly are several prairie species, but I think of them largely as being relatively rare. So I think a controversial thing to discuss is, are, you know, the hundreds of millions of butterflies that we have now, are they, is that a much higher number than perhaps 200 years ago? And of course, that's not really knowable. I mean, people have dug into the literature, looked for accounts of things, and it's really hard to get that far back. Mm-hmm. My sense about New England and the East, you know, Ohio East, is that it's not as, there isn't enough industrial agriculture to be limiting, you know, there's a lot of common milkweed out there. Now, you know, forest cover is, at least again in central New York, has certainly been increasing since the peak of deforestation, which I guess was maybe 1890 here. So there probably are less open habitats, but there's a lot of milkweed. But I think the dynamics, maybe to just quickly finish by saying the dynamics of which milkweeds where has really changed over the last couple hundred years. And I guess will continue to change.
Yeah. A couple other questions relate to issues around people that are, you know, raising monarchs, releasing monarchs. Any comments on that? Or, you know, are there concerns amongst conservation biologists about the effects of releasing these butterflies, rearing them in artificial settings, or is it a net positive for monarchs?
Yeah, that's another one of these things. There's a lot of discussion and controversy about that. I would say that my opinion is, you know, I always rear a few monarchs every summer with my family, and I encourage people to do it. It's magic. We should all, I mean, I think that people that are in touch with natural history are just a little more lovable and are likely to be more engaged with nature and be better conservationists themselves. So I think for that reason, rearing a couple is a great idea. I think there's where the controversy, you know, occurs is that there are people that raise hundreds of them, some of them using, you know, excellent technique, checking each butterfly for parasites and releasing them, and others probably are rearing many and are not able to check them or know how healthy they are. And so there's some potential for rearers, people that rear butterflies, monarchs, to be releasing diseased butterflies or that kind of thing, which is not good for the population, obviously. The prevalence of a common protozoan parasite has increased from about 1% to 10% over the last 20 years. And we don't know why, but I think home rearing has some potential to contribute to that. The last thing, though, I guess I would say is, you know, and I fall into this camp, everybody wants to help, or most of us want to help. I want to help. But I'm personally of the opinion that rearing more than a few to help the population is not an effective or likely to be an effective way to contribute. And I think that, you know, I often, there's definitely a problem. There's an environmental crisis in North America. The monarchs, I think, are a sentinel of that with their populations declining. And I sort of think of it sometimes as like a sink that's draining. And by rearing butterflies, even if they're all healthy, we're kind of adding a little bit more water into that sink. But we're not dealing with the real issue, which is, what is the environmental crisis that is causing the decline of not just monarchs, but of so many organisms, migratory birds, other insects, et cetera, et cetera. So that's maybe more of a philosophical issue, but I think we all want to help, and I encourage people to find ways that involve habitat conversion or preservation, as opposed to directly trying to feed any one particular population.
Mm-hmm. So we had a question here also about the sort of the Achilles heel maybe of the monarchs in terms of their overwintering in these very concentrated areas in Mexico. And someone is asking about issues with illegal logging there. And to some extent, sort of there's the biosphere reserve that you had mentioned. Sort of on the ground, how real is that, or how effective is that conservation?
I've been there many times. I would say that it's pretty darn effective. It's gotten much more effective in the last, maybe 15 years. It's an ongoing thing. So in 1983, the president of Mexico just declared with a memorandum that we're going to protect this. In 86, they set aside core forest areas. Since then, there are now many more buffer areas. There are, locals that are employed through the World Heritage Site, through the Biosphere Reserve. So I'd say it's not bad. It's quite good, and it's better all the time. There are all kinds of aerial photos that are taken every year so that there's much more accountability. But there's 7 billion of us, and it's just the classic issue of a growing population that rightfully wants to put its subsistence needs first, and so I think it's just a very difficult problem.
All right, and we had one question in here that's hinting at some controversy about monarch populations. This comment is there's apparently well-known scientists who say that monarch populations might not be declining at all, and I don't know if there's a controversy in the field about whether this decline that's been detected is sort of a real trend or just part of this, cycles of populations. I don't know if you can speak to that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the main controversy that has erupted a little bit around that, I would say it's very few. I mean, maybe the one person is Andrew Davis at the University of Georgia, who has in print been writing, and very recently, that there's no decline or there's no problem. I'd say most scientists, the data is sort of hard to, you can take out several points or whatever from that graph, and it's still significantly negative. Davis's point is that there is a lot of recovery every summer, and I think that that's true. But if the population must go through the 4 generations, then the Mexico overwintering sites are sort of a bottleneck, or a stage of the annual 4-generation cycle that most butterflies have to go through. So if that segment of the population is declining, perhaps it's not so important to if that continues to go down or gets close to zero, especially as it did in 2014, then the whole cycle is disrupted. Now, how low is too low? I don't know. I mean, there's still, in that super low year, I don't know if there were 10 million or was it 25 million butterflies or whatever. And again, they do have tremendous reproductive potential, but that was too close for my comfort. And I'd say I'm not as concerned as some people are. So,
so sort of following on that, we did have a question here about the potential listing of monarchs by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and someone's asking if you have any predictions on whether monarchs will be listed or deserve to be listed.
Yeah, I mean, I think the brilliance of the Endangered Species Act to me is that even though we target individual species, it's really about restoring ecosystems so that the species that they live in are functional. And I say that because I guess from that perspective, maybe monarchs should be listed. The petition was to list them as threatened, not as endangered. But I guess my prediction is that they won't be listed. Things that I thought really should have been listed, like not the prairie chicken, but the
Sage grouse.
Sage grouse. It's super political. In the case of monarchs, I mean, they basically occur, in every square mile east of the Rocky Mountains, and so I just don't know, kind of functionally, how that could be implemented. And the petition was also not specifically suggesting that monarchs might go extinct, but that the phenomenon of the annual 4-generation migratory cycle was under threat. So given that monarchs are, quote unquote invasive species in other parts of the world, the species is not going extinct. And I guess yes, there is some issue or potential problem with the annual migratory cycle, but I guess it's not likely to be listed. If it is, that'll be quite interesting, I think, because implementation of protective measures is going to be challenging and fun.
Yeah. So I had to sort of step back a little bit to just sort of more general community ecology interactions. Wondering if anyone has done any work on indirect interactions between monarchs and some of the other specialists on milkweeds, and whether, do you see evidence of, indirect competition between them, or, unusual co-occurrence patterns where they avoid plants that are, already colonized by another species of insect?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. Aphid feeding, and aphids are common on milkweed, tends to increase the quality. Monarchs grow a little bit faster on plants with aphids. Damage by this weevil in particular, often, I think some of it is just the plants become very unhealthy, get avoided by monarchs. And so there's a bunch of interesting community ecology out there. And I'm constantly telling folks that all of those insects have just as much of a right to be there and to sort of flourish on the milkweed. People are often contacting me about how to get rid of the beetles, or but they're all interesting species that have a story, unto themselves. So there are many interesting ecological interactions. The cerambycid tetraopes, it's named because it actually has 4 eyes, 4 functional eyes. Tetraopes, it's the longhorn black and red beetle. Its larvae feed on milkweed roots, and that also tends to increase the quality of the leaves for monarchs. And I think that's just physiology, damage to the roots, maybe pushes nitrogen or something like that into the leaves.
Cool. There's 1 or 2 other questions about conservation, but I wanted to get also at you've worked on sort of the phylogeny of milkweeds, their evolutionary history. Is there any sense for sort of how deep or old this connection is between monarchs and milkweeds? Like, what is the approximate age of this lineage? Any ideas about when it was colonized by some of these specialist insects?
Great question. My systematist colleagues, when there aren't real fossils, the classic answer is somewhere, the genus is somewhere between 5 and 20 million years old, which is probably true for many of the genera which we might be interested in. I guess I would specifically. Oh, and there's some hope, I think, for Pollinia in amber. That's what I'm waiting for, actually, as to help date some of the stuff. But the good news is there's basically a parallel to the monarch milkweed story again in Africa, and certainly the New World milkweeds were colonized from the Old World. That the phylogenetic information dictates or shows us that, and so I guess it's relatively ancient in the sense that early diverging lineages in Asclepius or Gomphocarpus were likely associated with early diverging Danaines in the Old World. So I'm not sure what that means. Does that mean tens of millions of years? But yeah, pretty long.
Cool. We also had 1 or 2 questions about the Western monarch population and sort of what's the story with that group, whether there's conservation concerns about them. And someone also mentioned, is the increase in populations of tachinid flies potentially responsible for the decline of the Western monarch populations?
Yeah, those are good questions. So there's this sort of somewhat isolated population in California of monarchs. They feed primarily on Asclepias fascicularis and speciosa. And speciosa is a kind of sister to the common milkweed. It looks very similar to our milkweed. It's the Western version, Western species. Um, that population is tiny, tiny compared to the eastern one that overwinters in Mexico, and it's been in severe decline. I think that the numbers are tragically low, and but it's not genetically almost at all distinct. And we now know through citizen science work that there's kind of leakage through Arizona. There's an incredible citizen scientist who tagged hundreds of butterflies at a single spot year after year. And in 1 year, butterflies that he tagged at the spot in Arizona ended up both in California and at the overwintering sites in Mexico. And they were claimed. I mean, the tags were found. So I guess the point of that is that the California population is geographically quite isolated, but is connected at least a little bit through exchange with Mexico. It's not genetically different. It's also in decline. Yeah.
Cool. So there was 1 or 2 questions that had come in through the chat about what plants monarchs do rely on for feeding, if they're the adults, the butterflies.
Yes.
So, in terms of meadow vegetation or plantings,
yes.
What are the important plants for monarchs?
I think that the flowers that fuel the southern migration tend to be the late summer fall flowering Asteraceae. I mean, there are certainly many, many others, but I mean, all of the goldenrods and other asters that occur basically throughout the flyway that are producing generous amounts of nectar. And so these butterflies fly about 30 miles during the day, and then late in the afternoon, you see them in the fields, on that flora of Asteraceae, and then they kind of take to trees, often on hedgerows and whatever, to spend the night. So yeah, I think really in most of the places that we all live, if you just abandon your lawn and did nothing, in 10 years you'd have a meadow that was rich in fall flowering natives. And
Cool. So you talked a little bit in your talk about, or quite a bit about, the cardiac glycosides and their role in defense of milkweeds. Could you say a little bit more about some of the other defense traits that milkweeds have in terms of their, sort of multiple defense strategies that they use against herbivores? What are some of the physical defenses or other ways of defending themselves?
Absolutely. So I talked a little bit about the trichomes and the latex, but most plants are just chemical cornucopia in terms of there's all kinds of things. The milkweeds are rich in saponins or saponins, which are thought to be defensive. Milkweeds, like many other plants, when they're munched on, release kind of sweet smelling volatile organic compounds, and predators and parasitic wasps and flies orient towards those volatile compounds, and then basically become a indirect defense, or kind of a bodyguard that gets called in. And we see, in monarchs, there are frequently parasitoids. Tachinid flies were mentioned, as well as wasps. And so, oh yeah, there was that, just very quickly, the question about tachinids. I think in the, what was it, in the 30s or 40s, a tachinid fly was introduced to control gypsy moths, Compsylura, and it really is just, it's an extreme generalist that does very well in monarchs, for sure. When I rear monarchs, I frequently find this tachinid coming out of it. And many of you probably know it's been implicated in some of the decline of the large moths of the Northeast. So that was a real disaster, the introduction of that generalist tachinid. some of the milkweed species, just to back to your other question, are super hairy. They're really waxy. We have a set of Asclepias species, maybe 10, that have a grayish waxy bloom on them. And that's a really interesting trait, I think, because it likely serves a physiological function for the plant, but also the insects on the plant have a very difficult time basically staying on. So they will fall off, especially if a predator approaches and that kind of thing. So yeah.
Cool. All right. I think we made it through most of the questions that had come in. If anyone's still out there, with a burning question you want to send into the chat, go ahead. Otherwise, I think we will thank Anurag for this, fascinating talk tonight. And there's a couple things piling in here. One last question then.
Sure, I'm happy to.
Yeah. For our region, do you think is any one milkweed species better than another for monarchs? So there's the swamp milkweed or common milkweed.
Yeah, I mean, I think common milkweed is just what they eat, what 90% of them, again, that make it to Mexico, Syriaca, what they feed on. I think if you have a wet spot in your landscape, yes, Asclepias incarnata is fabulous. It's beautiful. It has a different, it's not clonal. So some people don't like common milkweed because it's very spreading, and the swamp milkweed doesn't spread. And if you have a dry, gravelly place, planting butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa is a great one. It's often a little difficult to get started in a garden or in a landscape, but once it's there, it does really well. So yeah, those are the three. I mean, if you have a shady north-facing slope, there's a couple rare milkweeds that we have. Asclepias quadrifolia is a fabulous milkweed, but it's not really an important host for the monarch. The monarchs don't go into the shaded areas as much, and so, but it's a wonderful, slow-growing, very beautiful floral aroma on Asclepias quadrifolia as well.
Cool. All right. I think we'll close it there to let you go for the evening. We really appreciate you coming out and zooming in with us this evening. Great turnout. We had over 110 people at some point. So a big audience for thinking about the ecology and coevolution of monarchs and milkweeds. And good to see you, and glad that everyone seemed to enjoy the talk, despite one or two little glitches. All right.
Thanks a lot, Jesse.